Today, I will discuss how to teach fiscal policy and budgeting, including the inherent trade-offs and externalities. The main focus will be on standard SSEMA 3, elements A, B, and C. SSEF 2 and EF 1 are also relevant. Effective teaching is a balancing act between inundating students with content and oversimplifying to the point of creating misunderstandings. This is especially true when economics and government coincide with fiscal policy. Research by Hibbing and Thies-Morse show that students using textbooks that have been sanitized, that is, they have had the conflict and messy democratic processes of debate and negotiation removed from them, lead students to believe that political life in our country just happened. When this vision of political life is not matched in the real world, young adults are often turned off by the political process and tune out, thus increasing apathy. Hibbing and Thies-Morse suggest that social studies and political science professors emphasize that conflict in a pluralistic society such as ours is inherent, a part of democratic reality, because no one gets everything they want all of the time. Debate and discussion is necessary to understand differences, and compromise is necessary for democratic governance in a pluralistic society. Using democratic processes is slow and often messy. Let students see the realities of the process so they have a more realistic expectation of political life. Teaching with this in mind should reduce cynicism and apathy. After all, our goal is to have students think like economists and be part of civic life. We should provide opportunities for students to practice citizenship, but be cautious when using simulations to make them realistic, either in the simulation itself or during the debriefing. When I have had students participate in balancing the budget simulations, I have often heard the comment, "I did it. Why can't Congress?" Scaffolding instruction and adding layers of complexity to give students a realistic sense of fiscal policy will increase their understanding and make them more aware of the difficulties for fiscal policymakers. This slide is an overview of the rest of the module. Phase 1, Content. I give a short lecture on what is fiscal policy and how traditional budgeting occurs according to the Nixon Budget Control Act. The links below provide you with background information. The first link is to a Congressional Research Service document providing an overview of the process, including a timeline. The second link from the Congressional Budgeting Office, the CBO, provides a table of contents including 10-year and long-term budget projections, historical data, detailed revenue and spending projections. The third link is from the White House Office of Management and Budget, OMB. This website has good information, but is often very complex. When the President introduces a new budget, the OMB will have summaries and selling points of the budget, marketing it, if you will, to the public. The last link on this page is a link to the Senate page on how Congress works, and provides additional links to many very understandable documents on the budgeting process, including authorizations and appropriations. Once you are on the Senate page, start with the first link, an introduction to the federal budget process, to gain background knowledge. Here is the outline of my short lecture. Key points students need to understand before continuing. This is from the National Priorities Project, and they also have great flowcharts that provide visuals of the budget process. But this is not how we have been doing business. During 2007 to 2016, instead of a formal budget bill, Congress has been passing and the President signing continuing resolutions. These are similar to piecemeal planning, with each based on the previous year's budget, instead of completing a more detailed analysis of agency requests required by the rules of the full budget process. When Congress fails to pass a budget on time, continuing resolutions allow a way around budget caps. In essence, Congress gets to avoid making the tougher spending and revenue choices. A student once called this the wait until the last minute approach, and that does sum it up. Continuing resolutions do not face as much scrutiny as a budget bill, in part because of different rules and in part because of the hurry up and pass it pressure. Understanding the budget is made more difficult by media reporting. So the news will report that military spending was cut 2%. In reality, the military had asked for an increase of 3% from the previous year, and Congress authorized a 1% increase of the 3% request from the previous year. This is not a 2% cut in spending. This is a 1% increase in spending and a 2% cut in what was requested versus what they got. That's not a cut in spending. Be sure students understand the difference and how to read critically. Use the ask to put the whole situation in perspective for students. It's a 1-minute video. In the fundamentals unit, our class elects a class president. They make short campaign speeches and we vote. I also describe this in more detail in Teaching the PPC, Module SSEF6. At this time, I ask the class president what their platform was. They will answer, and I explain that now it is time for Congress to deliberate the new policy. But Congress wants guidance on how our country should pay for it. So how does the class president propose paying for their platform? 3 ways to pay. I explain each, including why tax increases and cuts to other programs are often unpopular. Then I define deficit and debt and explain how deficit spending leads to more debt. At this time, students usually say, well, we'll just cut other spending. That's the easiest thing to do. Well, not so much. I explain the difference between mandatory and discretionary programs at this time and share the breakdown of the budget. In 1970, mandatory spending, or programs already in existing law, made up about 30% of our budget. Now, mandatory spending is about 70% of our annual budget. If you enter the 2013 link to find the New York Times Interactive and click on Types of Spending, you will see a breakdown of mandatory versus discretionary spending. Explain the color scheme to students. Shades of green indicate proposed budget increases, and the orange shades are proposed budget cuts. The darker the color, the more of a cut or increase. The larger the circle, the larger the share of the budget for that department. Now scroll the mouse over to the mandatory side and see what the large circles are. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on debt. Explain to students that interest on debt is what our government pays to people who hold our bonds. We have to pay this for the stability of our financial system. You should teach personal finance before micro and macro. If you have not yet taught it, take time and explain bonds now. Make sure students know that people buy bonds because in the future they hope they will get their principal back plus interest. When bonds are sold that are very risky, for example, Greece and Venezuela government bonds in 2010, the interest must be high or people will not buy the bonds. Effectively, the government faces difficulties in reducing the interest on government debt, as this represents an opportunity cost to individuals or companies loaning money to government. They must receive some sort of compensation for their opportunity cost and assumption of risk. There is always a risk when loaning money that the loan will go into default. As creditors cannot repossess a country, They demand a risk premium for loans based on the likelihood of non-payment. The U.S. government has not defaulted on its debt since the new Constitution. As a result, it gets low interest rates on its bonds compared with other countries. Implicit in that lower interest rate is that the U.S. government will take steps to ensure repayment of the original loan amount, known as principal, and a payment representing the risk of default premium plus the opportunity cost to the lender, known as interest. As long as the risk of government default stays low, then interest rates demanded by borrowers will mostly reflect opportunity cost for lending. However, if government debt climbs to the level such that lenders fear not receiving their payments, then the risk premium dictates higher interest rates will be demanded by lenders. If the U.S. government arbitrarily sets the interest rate on bonds to be below what the lenders seek, then no one will choose to lend, that is, buy government bonds. At that point, government either has to reduce spending immediately to the level of tax receipts or must offer a higher interest rate sought by the market. Students will say, why don't we just not pay them at all? Explain that if we did that, no one would buy our bonds in the future and our spending would have to equal or be less than our taxable revenues. Students will also say, we owe Canada and they owe us. Let's just cancel each other out and call it evens. Explain that it is not always the Canadian government that owns our federal government bonds. Instead, Canadian businesses and individuals may also own them. The interest rates may not even be the same. No way to swap out the debt. Now, if you do the same on the discretionary side, see what the largest spending categories here are. Ask the president, be looking, which ones do you want to cut? And say, but let's look back in time. If you go to the 2011 link, it's even more dramatic. It grays out all the mandatory spending, leaving only the discretionary in color. Hopefully, in the future, the New York Times will continue to develop these very useful analysis tools. Tell the president, it's time to decide which of these discretionary categories would you like to cut. Explain that the spending cuts will cause trade-offs and externalities. Indeed, all choices do. Stress that mandatory spending can be changed, except for the interest on the debt. But changing mandatory spending will require another law to be passed by Congress that changes those existing programs. We could change interest on debt by having a lower debt. Now ask the president, which categories would you like to cut? They're going to be very reticent about this because they should realize by this time that these programs are very important to many people. So now they're starting to favor deficit spending. I show them the debt clock at this time, as it shows current year deficits and total debt. Put your mouse over any category and an explanation will appear at the top of the page. Use the Debt Clock Time Machine feature at the top right of the page to demonstrate how debt and deficit have changed since 1980. A new feature projects 2021. I'll let students look at this for about 10 to 15 minutes and answer their questions. After discussing the debt clock, the class president will often choose to increase taxes. I tell them I admire their courage to be honest to the public about how you're going to pay for something. I do warn them, you won't be popular. You may not get reelected. You'll have to educate the public about what you're going to do. How will you accomplish that? I want students to realize that none of the 3 ways to pay are easy. And Tinstaffel, there is no such thing as a free lunch, applies. Students often end up saying we should use a combination of these strategies to pay for things. And I tell them that's what our Congress does as well. This is the end of Part 1. Go to the next module, GADOE, Economics, SSEMA3, Part 2, for the conclusion. Thank you.